I'm Allison Overseth, the Executive Director of the Partnership for Afterschool Education. On behalf of all of us, thank you so much for joining us today. It is always a good thing when we are pulling very good minds together to think about and address the issues that challenge young people, particularly young people living in poverty in New York City. The Partnership for Afterschool Education works with 1,600 community-based youth organizations throughout the city, all 5 boroughs. We estimate these organizations reach roughly 500,000 children a year. The young people that we are working with majority are living in poverty, majority are dealing with extraordinary challenges in their lives, both due to poverty but also due to other systems in their lives that are not fully functioning the way that we really wish and hope that they could, including the public school system. The after-school institution in a child's life is wildly important. Most of us would, if we are able to afford it, would offer our children all the opportunities they possibly could to find their passion in life, to find what they care about, but also to supplement where they could fall, to find times where we can help be supportive of everything from their difficulties in science to their love of learning to finding something when it's been a really difficult day and social and emotional skills that can help them overcome hurdles that will confront them as children, as adults in life. When all goes well, we have the extraordinary opportunity to allow young people who may have been viewed by some as sort of accidents waiting to happen, at risk we hear, or concerns about pregnancy, drug use, or other sorts of things. We allow them to become these extraordinary, responsible adults who are able to enjoy everything in life and to fully participate both economically but also socially and as responsible citizens in this community. So it's a wildly important job. The really good news for all those challenges, we have the most extraordinary people that are working on this on behalf of all of us as a community of New York City to help young people. And if I could have all of the people that work directly at community-based organizations or are in young people's lives stand up, please let us give a chance to recognize you. I see a few are still sitting down. Okay, thank you for being here. The way that PASE is involved to help all of this is we are a very small organization with a very broad reach. We do a lot of work in terms of professional development. 4,000 people who work with children after school came through PASE's doors last year alone to come in and to find professional development opportunities, everything from how to put a great drama program to increase literacy skills, to how to think about young people who have particular mental health challenges, to how to, as a small community-based organization, to bolster your own budgeting and staff such that you're able to provide these services. We also do a lot of resources. Out on the table when you first checked in, there is a new youth outcomes inventory which speaks to those sorts of competencies that we think can be developed in after-school hours, and we've spent a lot of time working with our colleagues in the field to be able to develop that. But one of the most important things we do is bring research and other sorts of knowledge that are available to people who are practicing directly with young people. And it is in that context that we are delighted to have Pedro Noguera with us today. You all received both a fabulous picture of, but also a bio of Pedro when you checked in. And we are delighted to have him here today. Roughly a year ago, I first heard Pedro speak, and I have to say much of the research that he was describing has greatly influenced how we're doing things at PACE right now. He had just at that time finished a massive research project on how young boys of color, both African American and Latino, in the public school systems were faring. This data, which I'm sure he'll reference today, is sort of beyond depressing, quite frankly. And what it really speaks to is that there are large segments of our society for whom we are not getting it done. And as we are sort of the supervising adults and are responsible for this as a community, we really need to learn from that and to think about that and the implications of that. The good news, in part of that data, is that we know who these young people are and we know when they are at risk of failing, and we know some very good data about how we can help that. And so interventions and ways to think about how communities can coalesce to become advocates on behalf of young people is an enormous aspect of things. And so as we think about school systems that both can't do everything they would probably want to be able to do or are able to do right now, but also for the young people that we're just not getting it done for collectively, this is when communities and school systems and other systems in the city can work together. So it's in that spirit that we are delighted to have Pedro here to really talk about what's going on in his research at the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education, we all call Metro Center, at NYU, and to really think about how we collectively, in many of the different sectors that are represented here, can help improve what's going on in young people's lives so that we have these extraordinary and rich opportunities to collectively help our citizenship. Pedro, we're happy to have you here. Thank you for being here. I'm not going to read the whole bio because you have it in front of you, but there's a lot of really great degrees here, and he is known from on the urban sociologist front from his undergraduate work at Brown, and then subsequently his doctorate at UC Berkeley. And so I laugh when I invited somebody from California to come today, and they're like, oh yeah, I know him from way back when. So through this national reputation, we're delighted to have you here, and thank you very much. At the end, Pedro will take questions and things, so we will write down notes if you have questions along the way, and we'll talk about those later. Pedro.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to be here. I want to thank PASE and Allison particularly for the invitation to speak to you this morning. I want to say it's particularly an honor to do it in the name of Janet Kelley, a person who's devoted much of her professional life to this work. It's often the case that we don't honor people while they're still with us. And so it is, I think, a good thing that Jan is still alive and kicking with us, and we're honoring her in this way because it's important that she know that we appreciate the kind of work she's done. Education is a topic in the news a lot these days, especially here in New York. And that's a mixed blessing. It's a good thing because it keeps us focused on the importance of education, and I think because of that, many different constituencies in the country who previously hadn't shown a lot of interest in education are now very interested. You know, hedge funds, large corporations, making significant investments, mostly in charter schools, but still, nonetheless, it is a time where great scrutiny is being placed on what's going on in our schools and what's happening with young people, and I think that's mostly a good thing. It is unfortunately also problematic in many ways because with that attention often comes, I think, some confused thinking about what it takes to solve and address the problems facing our nation's schools. And I would say that I often find myself right in the middle of these debates because I don't take easy positions on the issues. The issues tend these days to be framed in very polarizing terms. Right? You're either for or against charter schools. Well, I actually support charter schools if they're good and if they're serving all kids and not screening out those that are harder to serve. There's big debate now over whether or not we should judge teachers based on student test scores, which I mostly think is a bad idea, especially given that we know many teachers typically impact a student's achievement, not a single teacher. And what's more, if you really want to avoid getting teachers to fixate only on what's going to be on the test, then you'd be concerned about this too, because judging teachers by test scores is likely to have that effect. At the same time, we should all be concerned that there be evidence that kids are learning, that there be evidence of growth and progress. And so I think we're on the right issue, but focused sometimes on the wrong thing. Right now, the big issue we're dealing with in New York is the question of mayoral control, right? Mostly because of the appointment of the new chancellor, or at least the attempted appointment of the new chancellor. And I support mayoral control, and I think that there's been progress in New York City under Mike Bloomberg and Joel Klein. At the same time, I also support checks and balances, because I think in a democracy, you need to have scrutiny on our public officials and the way decisions are being made. And I think as we'll see with the debate as it unfolds about this appointment, having a public process is actually good for schools because it forces accountability not just on the kids and the teachers, but also on the people in charge. And I think that that's essential. And somehow in the accountability discussions, that gets left out. So I want to just acknowledge that while we may not like to think of education as a political issue, invariably it is. From the politics of what we cut when we cut budgets, to the politics of the kind of policies we enact, to who runs our schools, these issues you can't avoid. And although the after-school sector sometimes seems buffered from some of this, more often than not, after-school education is trying to compensate and supplement and make up for what's gone wrong in the K-12. And so we can't really avoid it either. And while we may not want to engage in highly polarized debates, we do need to understand what's going on out there. We've spent a lot of time at my center trying to understand what are the impacts of some of the policies, how different populations of children are faring, and trying to draw attention to the ways in which the promises that are made by policymakers often don't have the results that have been promised. We tried to point out, and Janet alluded to this a while ago, that even in a city like New York, where graduation rates have been rising, they've not been rising for certain groups of kids. If for Black and Latino males, it's less than 30% who will graduate with Regents degrees. The Regents diploma will still be the only diploma offered in New York State. And there's really no plan in New York City about how we're going to make sure that large numbers of kids don't end up dropping out of school because we've raised the bar without a plan for how to help kids meet that higher standard. Right? And so I think it's important, even if you're in the after-school sector, to understand that these policies will also impact you, because you're going to be called on in many cases to help and assist the children that the schools haven't helped, or at greater risk now of not graduating, or at greater risk of slipping through the cracks. And so it's important to understand where those cracks are and why they exist and who's most likely to slip through. We've been asked to do a study on what are called long-term Ls, English language learners. The large numbers of kids across New York City who are labeled as English language learners but never learn English. Right? They're in our program sometimes 10, 12 years. And in many cases, they graduate from our schools semi-literate in 2 languages now. Right? Because they no longer have their first language, because we didn't develop that. And now they still don't have English. So they're really in trouble when it comes to entering the labor market, because more often than not, they're not going to go to college. So we have huge challenges that we face. I hope that Ms. Black, if she's approved, is ready for this challenge. Sometimes when you, you don't quite know what you're getting when you end up in positions like these, and I hope she's up to it, because these are tall challenges we face as a city and with the largest school system in the country. I have been one of several people in the country advocating for a change in the direction of federal education policy. About 3 years ago, we put out a position paper and then ads in major newspapers across the country calling for a broader and bolder approach to the way we support schools and children. And basically, we just call for 3 things. And to us, these seemed pretty non-controversial. Universal access to health care for children, because pretty compelling evidence that sick kids don't do that well in schools. And we have large numbers of kids, particularly in poor communities, who have chronic asthma, who have diabetes, who are undernourished, and this clearly impacts learning, it impacts child development. We call for universal access to preschool, because all the research shows that the investments we make during infancy for children have an impact on what happens throughout their lives. The achievement gap doesn't start at 5, it starts well before 5. And we've known for a long time that the gaps simply in literacy and vocabulary that are there during infancy impact a child throughout their learning experience, and it's very hard to make up for those. And so it's always ironic, because we like to compare how well the United States is doing to other countries, and consistently we're falling further and further behind. Just 3 weeks ago, it was announced that we were 48th in the world in math and science, which is pretty shocking given that we were just 27th 2 years ago. Okay. And unfortunately, I don't think our policymakers even understand why the policies we pursued have resulted in that further decline. But they're going to continue to pursue the same policies because they can't understand it. And one of the things I always point out to them is if you look at the vast number of countries that are outperforming us, one of the things they all have is universal access to preschool. Because just the evidence is so compelling and so clear that the learning that starts out when children are young is so important in creating an intellectual foundation for them throughout their lives. The third thing we advocated was the expansion of extended learning time, after school in the summer, because it is so clear, and I think Malcolm Gladwell made this point especially well, our children are being shortchanged. They're simply not getting as much learning time. In some cases, 40 and 50 days less school time than children in other countries. We have a shorter day, a shorter year, and it shows in the results. And so finding ways to expand the learning time is essential. It's essential not just in terms of achievement, although that's important. We want kids to do well academically, want them to graduate, want them to go to college in greater numbers, but it's also important in terms of development. And I have to say there is a difference, and I think unfortunately a lot of our policymakers don't really know it. Right? That is, when you're focused on child development, you actually approach the education of children differently than if you're focused only on achievement. When you're focused on development, you recognize that in order to develop into healthy adults, we have to create learning environments that are supportive of the whole person, which means we would never want to focus narrowly on test preparation, because we also have to focus on social and emotional development. We have to focus on the physical aspects. We have to focus on the arts, because we want well-rounded people who are going to be able to function as responsible adults and contribute back to society. And all the evidence for many, many years has shown that a well-rounded education that addresses all aspects of a human development is essential. But now, because we've become so fixated on achievement, you literally see schools that in the name of raising test scores take away art, take away music. It's not on the test. Sometimes take away science. Now, not in New York, but in states where science is not in the 4th grade, you see schools that have taken away science so they could do double-period math and literacy. At a time when obesity is the #1 health challenge facing children in America, you see schools taking away phys ed and recess. Recess. The only thing that kids like sometimes is recess. And they're taking it away. And, you know, the truth is our kids need a balanced education. I saw a study the other day that said that eating lunch was good for test scores, and I said, thank God. Thank God they might take lunch too. Our kids need lunch and music and art and phys ed, where they need a well-rounded education. And if you focus on child development, you get that immediately. I was on a panel not long ago with James Comer. James Comer, psychologist at Yale University, has been an advocate for developmental-focused education and for schools that engage parents as partners and function more like community centers, in the same way the Children's Aid Society has been doing for many years. And he was asked a question. He said, they were asked, what are teachers not getting today that they should be? And he said they're not getting any training on child development. And as a result, we are seeing schools where the educators simply don't know how to relate to the children they're teaching. And that usually shows up in the inability to manage a classroom, but it shows up in other ways as well, the inability to make intellectual connections with children, because you simply don't know how to communicate effectively, don't know how to help them make sense of the material or understand how those ideas can be applied in the real world. So I would say that figuring out how to shift the focus, and I think after school is a great place to do this, so that we are focusing on the whole child, we are focusing on the developmental needs of children, makes so much sense. And it's so essential, because when we don't do that, what we find is that particularly the neediest kids end up not thriving, not doing as well. But I would add here there are lots of middle-class kids, lots of affluent kids even, who also show up being at risk too. There's been a lot of attention to the film Waiting for Superman, I want to recommend another one called A Race to Nowhere. Looks at the impact of high-stakes testing on children. But the children it focuses on are affluent children, the kids who are working so hard because their parents are pushing them to get into good colleges and universities, and they're totally stressed out. In many cases, they're medicated because they have to take antidepressants. They're not getting enough sleep at night. They don't have balanced social lives because from the time they were 5, their parents were thinking about how to get them into Harvard. And I don't think this is a good thing either. So it is not the case that it's only the neediest children, at least in terms of socioeconomic status, who are at risk. There are lots of kids in America who are at risk in different ways. And so I think after school is a place where we need to think about how do we buffer and respond to those risks? How do we create a setting where all the needs of children can be met and where we can provide some of the guidance and support that so many children need? After school can do this, but it can't simply be more school. Okay? And I think that's something that many of you who have been in the sector get right away, right? Especially now, given that what's happening in school often is not either intellectually stimulating for kids nor gratifying and satisfying their other needs. I always say something is clearly wrong when the longer they're in school, the more they hate it. Most 5-year-olds actually like school, right? But the longer they're there, the less they like it. You know what's ironic? A lot of times the adults don't like it much either, right? So it's clearly something wrong with the way we've done this whole enterprise that's off. But after school certainly need not be like that. Right? In fact, if it is, you won't attract the kids. I think most of you figured that out a long time ago, that you have to do something different. If we're going to really engage, especially if we're going to get the kids there who need it, we're going to have to find ways to make what we offer compelling, engaging, and not just be babysitting. Right? Parents are happy for babysitting, especially parents who are struggling with managing jobs and raising families, but our kids need so much more than that. So I want to refer you now to a document. It's called Learning in After School. It's actually, you can look it up on the web. It's a set of national organizations. I'm not sure PASE is part of it, but I know TASK, the After School Corporation, is part of it. A number of others have been trying to get it clear. What should high-quality after-school education look like? What needs to be there? And they identify 5 things. And I think they all make lots of sense. The first is that learning should be active. Right? And I think anybody who's been in school for a long time and knows that in too many classrooms we still practice the cemetery method. You know the cemetery method of teaching? Line them up in rows, keep them as still as possible. That passive learning does not work for lots of kids. Right? Sitting and listening for long periods of time results in children who become distracted, who are bored, simply not engaged. And too often that's what is happening in many of our schools, particularly our high schools. After school has to be a place where kids become actively involved, where they take more ownership of learning, where they are allowed to see how knowledge gets applied in the real world, where they're able to understand why certain ideas are important and meaningful to their lives. Because when that can happen, then knowledge becomes really powerful. I've seen this happen in many cases in after-school programs. Working with a school in Oakland, California, where a teacher was trying to figure out how to make an environmental science course relevant to her 8th graders. I took the teachers on a tour that summer of West Oakland. And I did that because the teachers have been complaining so much about the behavior of the kids, and when I challenged them and asked how much they knew about the kids and their community, they knew very little. So we went on a tour, and we came back. Most of the teachers said they didn't like the experience of being on the tour. So they felt like tourists, and people were staring at them in the bus. And one teacher said, I noticed something that I thought was interesting. I said, what's that? She said, I noticed that many of the homes in this neighborhood have gardens in the backyard. I said, well, why is that interesting? She said, well, they may not realize that the soil is toxic because this neighborhood is surrounded by heavy industry. And there's probably lead in the soil. And if they're eating from the vegetables from those gardens, they may be getting sick, especially the children. And I said, well, that's a very interesting observation. I said, well, what are you going to do with that? She says, well, I teach environmental science, and I'm going to run a science after-school program this year, and I think I'm going to get my kids to focus on this issue. So I watched as this unfolded, and she started by showing how the lead goes from the atmosphere into the soil, how it goes from the soil into the plants, and what happens when you ingest vegetables that come from gardens that are toxic with lead, particularly in the development of small children. She then teaches her students to go out and do soil testing. And so they go out throughout their community testing the soil, trying to figure out where is the toxicity greatest, coming up with hypotheses for why it might be greater in one area than another, which then leads them to discover the brownfields that have been built over, right? Places that once had foundries but now have homes. And they start to understand the community in a different way, understand why the health patterns they see in the community are what they are, which is a very sick community in many ways. They produce these beautiful charts using GPS, and she's thrilled because the kids have been so engaged. They're like little scientists out there doing this work, and then she's ready to move on, and one of the kids says, we can't move on. She says, why not? He says, because now we have to warn the people. She said, oh, I hadn't thought of that. He said, yeah, because there's poison out there, and now we have to let people know they have poison in their gardens. So she said, well, let me think about that. So she comes to me and she says, my kids said we got to warn the people. How do I warn the people? I said, well, I actually know the director of the health department in Alameda County. Let's talk to him. And we come and we explain to him what our students have done, and she shows them the charts. And this is a school, the only reputation this school had is a reputation for trouble, for a place that had problems, low scores, bad behavior. And so he's shocked that this is the kind of work coming from the students. He said, well, let me go and meet these students. I want to hear what they're doing. And he does, and the students are very proud, and they make a report on their research, and they show these charts. And afterwards he says, okay, we're going to do two things. He said, first, we're going to send out a notice to every home, warning them about the effects of lead in the soil. And two, I'm going to offer every home that wants it free topsoil for their gardens. So the kids start cheering, and the teacher feels great, and we all feel great that this looks like it's had a good resolution. But the thing that struck me most is that those kids will now know about the effects of lead in their environment probably forever. But what's more is they also know that science can be an instrument to solve real problems. Right? That it's not something you simply do to satisfy a requirement on a test. It's something you can do and use to actually improve your neighborhood and your life. And I think that kind of lesson is invaluable. And it's the kind of lessons that we need to make sure our children are getting through after-school programs, to see that knowledge is a source of power. Second principle is that learning should be collaborative. It should be collaborative because part of what kids need to learn is how to work with other people. Because if you don't learn that, often you don't do very well in the workplace. Right? And a lot of research on the social and emotional development of children, that developing those kinds of skills, the ability to problem solve, the ability to communicate, the ability to listen, the soft skills are so vital to success later on in life. Success not just in the workplace, success in your relationships throughout your life. Very hard to teach those things if you're fixated only on what's going to be on the test, because they don't show up there. They have to be embedded in what we do. They have to be a part of our whole approach to teaching children. And this is, again, another tall order that many teachers, it's a lot to ask. But I would say if you don't have a class where children have learned to work together, you can never do group work. And if you can't do group work, then you're going to go back to the passive learning, because that's what's the easiest to pull off. Right? I would say the least effective way to learn is the easiest way to teach. It's a problem for the kids, though. And when you go into a classroom where you see kids who have taken ownership of learning and they're working together and meeting and talking and planning and work is actually being done, you're actually seeing a very high level of teaching. Because that takes more work. It takes more, a greater skill, because you have to be able to facilitate that kind of learning and help kids have the skills so that they can take control themselves. Well, after school is a place where we can do that. And it is a place where we can also, in the course of that, cultivate leadership, cultivate the kind of character in children that is going to be, again, essential to becoming responsible adults later on. My daughter, who's a senior in high school now in New York City at School of the Future, she works with a group called NY to NO. It is a group started by high school students in New York City who are in partnership with schools in New Orleans. And they go in the summer and they go on breaks and they do urban gardening and they work with a school down there to support the development of the school. And the amazing thing about it is it's all student-led. They don't have an adult advisor. They plan their trips. They plan seminars for each other. And often they meet at my house, so I get to see them in action. And what I'm struck by is the maturity they show in working together and in holding each other accountable for the work. Right? What each person agreed to do, and they demand a lot of each other. And working with my daughter last night, actually, on her college essays, and this is what she spent a lot of time writing about. That is what she's learned through this work, what she's learned about leadership, about dealing with other people. Because if you can deal with a conflict with one of your peers in high school, chances are you're going to be able to deal with conflicts with people in the workplace and in other aspects of your life later on. And they're learning that. And our after-school programs have to give kids those opportunities too. They have to give them the chance to understand how to work with other people and why it's important, and especially important across differences related to race and culture and sexuality, because that's also part of the world. And if we don't give our kids those skills, they are shortchanged. And so I want to encourage you to make sure that as you think about the kinds of learning opportunities you create for kids, that's built in to the work itself. The third principle is that it should be learning that's meaningful. And I would add, anything that's meaningful in terms of learning is also culturally relevant. Right? Because it can't be meaningful if it's not culturally relevant. It has to be something that a child can relate to, a child can understand. And this, I think, is something that all children benefit from an education that's meaningful, but especially kids who have not been on the pathway to college since they were born. Right? I would say, when I ask my NYU students, when did your parents first start thinking about college for you? One of them said, I think the night after I was conceived, they began thinking about college for me. I said, well, how do you know that? He said, well, my mother told me. She said, put my name on a preschool waiting list while she was still pregnant, right? Because they wanted to get me into the best preschool. Right? Because middle-class, college-educated parents are planning, they're doing the work well in advance to think about the child's future, the child's education, and because of that, the kids have a clear sense, or tend to, let's be clear, not all of them, tend to have a clearer sense that college is important, that the decisions they make now are going to have an impact later on. But kids who come from families where no one's gone to college, where college is a total mystery, don't have that sense at all. For them, college is this great unknown. And if we wait until 12th grade to try to teach them about college, it's usually too late for many of them. One of my colleagues, Kristen Luker, has been studying teen pregnancy. She asked the question, why is it that middle-class girls are less likely to have babies than poor girls as teenagers? What she finds in the research is that sex is not really the issue, though clearly sex is involved. What she finds is that it is the understanding that having a baby at 15 is a bad idea if you're going to college that really influences those choices. Future aspirations affect the behavior of our kids now. And part of making learning relevant and meaningful means to help kids to make better choices, to understand how the decisions they make now will affect their lives later on. That's a developmental challenge too, because developmentally kids can't always see that far ahead, don't understand the future, particularly in early adolescence. But it's something that we've got to work on with them, because if we don't do that, then we find that kids make bad choices, choices that ultimately do have long-term consequences that hurt them. One of the groups that's figured out a way to do this, I think in a very powerful way, is citizen schools. Citizen schools started in Boston, now they're coming into New York and other parts of the country, and most of their work is done after school. And they figured out a while ago that mentoring is important, but we knew that already, that mentoring was important. But they realized that the kind of mentoring that's most important is that when you connect a student with an adult mentor who shares their interests. Because it is through that activity that the young person is interested in learning more about that the mentoring becomes so much more meaningful and valuable. And whether the interest be architecture or gardening or needlework or whatever it is, if you can find a way to connect young people with other adults who share those interests, part of what we're doing two things. We're, one, expanding their access to influential adults who can later write letters of recommendation, who can maybe open doors and provide that social capital that is so essential to opportunity later on. But it also exposes them to mastery, to competence, to understanding that it is in the high performance of work, it is in the passion you develop for a field, for a project, that you find great joy in your life. And a lot of our kids don't see that. They don't get to see adults who are passionate about what they do, who love what they do and understand it, can explain it because it's so meaningful to them and so purposeful. And so I want to encourage you to think about ways to do that. How do we get young people connected to work and activities that are meaningful, that get them to think deeply about what they're doing, about why the activities are important in itself? Because when that happens, chances are it's going to result in much higher level of performance. Which leads to the fourth one, which is that learning should also be masterful. Right? It should focus on high levels of competence. It should focus on ensuring that young people have a clear sense of what good work is. It's interesting, Howard Gardner, who started out doing a lot of his work early on the concept of multiple intelligence, has shifted in recent years to focusing on what he calls good work. Right? And he looks at people in various fields and who do good work consistently over time and what makes that possible. And one of his arguments is that we have to expose young people early on to the idea of good work, of a high degree of competence. That is, that it's not simply good enough to pass the test or to even get A's, right? Because A's aren't necessarily evidence of mastery. Right? I want to encourage you to read a book called How to Succeed in School Without Really Learning by Laborie, right? Lots of kids getting A's still don't know the subject very well. They know how to do school well, right? But they don't necessarily have deep, substantive knowledge over the subject. And after-school learning is a place where that can happen, where we can encourage that kind of deeper level of understanding and clarity around mastery and what that looks like in different fields and what competence looks like in different fields. I'll mention here my daughter's school as an example where that happens. She goes to School of the Future, and every student in every grade is required to do an exhibition because they don't think the state standards are good enough. They want to make sure the kids can actually write. Right? So they work on projects with their teachers, and they have advisories because they believe that one counselor to 300 or 400 students is not much counseling. So every teacher is an advisor. And in their advisories, which meet once a week, they work on these exhibitions. And they get feedback and they develop projects, and at the end of the year they have to present what they've learned to other students, teachers, and parents. They do that because they believe that if you can actually teach what you've learned to someone else, then you really have to know it. They also believe that if you're giving a student feedback throughout the year on a project, right, that's where the real learning takes place. The learning is in the feedback. The learning is in the revision. The learning is in understanding what it takes to get it to a higher standard. The learning is not simply in completing it. Right? How many of you know kids who say, I took chemistry, They don't know a damn bit of chemistry, but they took it, right? You know some of them, right? Right? So I want to say, me too, right? Because we're not focused on the competence. My daughter, for her 9th grade history exhibition, she did a study on the Roman and the Inca Empire. She had to explain how these empires rose, why they eventually collapsed, look at their politics, religion, culture. She had to have multiple sources. She had to have lots of evidence. She produced a 25-page research paper as a 9th grader. And then the PowerPoint to present it back to the broader community. And I believe if you can do that as a 9th grader, you could probably be okay in college. But I also believe it's a sign of a real focus on mastery, because it's not simply the high-achieving students that are expected to do that. Special ed students are expected to do that. English language learners are expected to do that. And because they're getting that kind of direct support from teachers and counselors along the way, they can. Now, it doesn't mean they all produce the same standard, but they understand what the standard is, what they're aiming for. Right? And I think that's the key. And we've got to do that in lots of other ways, in helping our kids to understand that getting it through, getting it done, is not good enough if we didn't get it right. That really what matters is the evidence that they understand, the evidence that they get it. And I can't say enough that it's so often missing in their school experiences. And Afterschool is a place, I think, that we have to make sure that our kids get exposed and understand more clearly what good work is, what competence is, what it looks like when you do it well, because, again, those are attributes that will carry with them way after they graduate from high school and college. The 5th principle is the notion that learning should expand horizons, that learning should make it possible to dream, to see new possibilities, and I would add, most importantly, to break stereotypes. To break stereotypes. Because part of what is limiting our children is the notion that who they are is determined by their race or their neighborhood or their some other attribute about them, and that limiting sense often results in kids who simply don't believe they can accomplish great things in life. Right? And it's not their fault, because they don't create the stereotypes. Stereotypes are out there. Right? I did a lot of research in the Caribbean, and one of the things that struck me when I was doing work in Barbados, Barbados is a much poorer country than the United States, but has a higher adult literacy rate than the United States. When I was there a few years back, 300 students took the SAT through the U.S. Embassy because they wanted to apply to college in the United States. The average SAT score was just over 1,200. This is a time when 1,600 was the highest score. That's a fairly good score. All the students who took the test were black, and all of them were poor, low income. How come being black and poor is not an obstacle to achieving at high levels in Barbados? And it's not because they have the great technology, because they don't, right? Or they don't have the most modern facilities. But what they do have is the very clear sense that not only can all children learn, they actually believe they better learn. Right? And a lot of folks still practice corporal punishments. They figure they can make it happen too, right? But they also don't believe that their race determines what they can be. When you talk to kids in Barbados and you ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? They don't say rap star or ball player, because they think they can be anything they want. They don't believe that their horizons and their sense of what's possible is limited by that. But if you talk to kids in this country, particularly in the inner city, you often find kids whose aspirations have been limited. And I would say they're limited by circumstance. It's very easy to blame them, but if the only thing you're being exposed to are giant pictures of LeBron James, like the one that was hanging at 34th and 8th, right, 100 feet high. At 19, they were calling him King James, right, sitting on a throne. And what makes him a king? The fact that he played basketball very well and now earns lots and lots of money. Right? And if you're a young person struggling to get by and you see a picture like that, you say, well, I want to be like that too. Right? Why not? And so we see kids who will put hours and hours and hours into playing basketball or into their music, and none of that kind of investment into other activities, to learning. And consequently, we see lots of kids with very limited options later on. So finding ways to break these stereotypes, to expand their sense of what's possible, that takes work. It doesn't just happen. It takes work because, in many cases, they don't want to learn about things that are outside their experience. They have to find ways to make it attractive. I was at Excellence Charter School, a school for all boys, mostly black boys in Bed-Stuy. They've got these kids playing chess. They've got these kids playing violin. They've got these kids doing debate because they believe that the way to challenge the stereotypes is to deliberately expose these young boys to lots and lots of other activities early. Visiting Eagle Academy in the Bronx. Eagle Academy is another school for boys that was created. When David Banks started Eagle Academy, he created it with the clear goal. He said, we have to create a school where the culture of the school is more powerful and compelling than the culture of the streets. Because they've been losing boys to the streets, losing boys to gangs. So how do they do that? They designed a school that is more like a prep school than a typical urban high school, where kids have access to fencing, rugby, chess. And I was like, what made you offer these things? They said, well, we want our kids to think they're in a prep school. And I was asked a couple years ago to be a judge for a robotics competition that takes place at the Javits Center. You go there, US First puts on this every year. If you want to go see a bunch of kids very excited about robots, be prepared with earplugs because it's also very loud in there. And so I'm a judge, and I find out that the kids from Eagle Academy have come in 6th place. So I let them know, you guys came in 6th place, and they start jumping up and down. I said, well, guess what? 6th place is not good enough to go to the finals. Only the top 3 teams go to the finals, and the top 3 teams were, as you might expect, Bronx Science, Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech. They said, well, we think 6 is still good. I said, I agree. Now explain to me how you built the robot. I said, well, the first person to help us was the custodian. I said, the custodian helped you build a robot? I said, oh yeah, he got us the parts. We don't know where he got them from, but every time we needed a part, the custodian would come through, get us the parts we needed. He was critical. I said, well, who else helped you? They said, well, our science teacher helped us. And they said, there he is, and he's there, and he's half asleep. I said, wow, you look so tired. And he said, that's because I was up till 4 in the morning with these kids last night, working on his robot. I said, up to 4 in the morning? He said, listen, I've been working weekends, we've been working nights. I said, you guys have been working weekends and nights? They all shake their heads. For the last 3 months, working on the robot. And then explained that this is not just about putting the parts together. You actually have to understand the math and physics behind the robot. Because if the arm doesn't do what it's supposed to do, you have to go back to the drawing board. These kids were so engaged, so proud of what they had done. I said, okay, well, you don't get to go to the Georgia Dome for the finals. What's next? What do you guys want to do next? And every single one said the same thing. They said they want to be mechanical engineers. And they think they can because they built the robot. These are kids that come from neighborhoods where there are no mechanical engineers. Being a mechanical engineer was not even part of couldn't have been part of their horizon because it simply wasn't part of their experience. But they were in a school that made it part of their experience. One of the things that Eagle Academy figured out a long time ago is that to compete with the streets, you have to actually keep the kids busy much more time. You have to keep them at school longer. So they have a longer day, a broad array of activities. Because the only way to compete with the gangs is to keep the kids busy and preoccupied with good things. So we need to find ways that break stereotypes, break the influence of the streets, expand kids' sense of possibility, increase their exposure to influential adults, and all of that can happen through after school. After school is a great venue, great setting to make that happen, great setting for mentorship. It's a great setting for building the kind of relationships that we know our kids need to be more successful. So I encourage you, as you think about the work you do and how to make it compelling, how to make it effective, how to make sure that it's having the impact on the children that we need to serve most, that you also ask, is what we're offering of high quality? How do we know that it's high quality? Are the people who provide the training well trained? Are they skilled? Do they know what they do or what they're doing? We can't treat after school simply as a babysitting program. We really have to focus on quality because if we want to use it to have an impact on long-term outcomes for young people, it has to be of a very high standard. So I hope that what I laid out gives you some sense of what that standard needs to look like, what it should consist of. It's not the same as what we think about in terms of achievement in schools. Right? The principles I outlined are actually very different in nature. But I would say if we can do those things, we can produce young people who not only do well on tests, but who also do well in life. And I think that's really what we're after, is young people who become more capable of taking responsibility for their lives, contributing to their families, and to their community in this country. So with that, I'll stop and hopefully take some questions. Thank you. Yes, way back.
You gotta identify yourself and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, Pedro. I'm Carla Harris. I'm the Managing Director here at Morgan Stanley. Question for you. Do you think the only way that we can affect the type of change that you're talking about, particularly within the system as it currently exists in, let's take New York City, for example, and even the public school system, and even some of the private schools, do you think the only way we can affect the kind of change, particularly for the inner city students that you're talking about, is through the after-school programs, because there's such a log jam, if you will, or the historical encumbrances, let me put it like that, of the way things have run in the past will prevent us from integrating some of the suggestions that you talked about this morning in the everyday school life and environment?
Well, one of the big advantages that many charter schools have is they can simply offer a longer day. The extended day allows them to build many of the kinds of activities I described into the day. So the school I mentioned in Bed-Stuy, Excellence, those activities are all occurring during the day, but kids don't get out till 4:30 in the evening. So they have a longer day. And many KIPP schools do the same sort of thing. So, but I would say, why not create the possibilities for that to happen in public schools as well? Right? Because I'm doing some work right now in Newark, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to change the day. We're trying to change the teacher contract to allow for that longer day. There's a high school here in Brooklyn called New Generation High School that's doing that same kind of work, because they found ways to increase the length of the day because teachers are on staggered schedules, increase the length of the year. So it makes a lot of sense. But we have to be willing to change the structure to make it happen. So, Carol. I'm sorry, I'll get you next. I didn't see this microphone. But.
Okay. As you know, we've worked a lot in the past. And the frustration at this point is getting all the stakeholders, and that includes school systems, to recognize the importance for the integration of these services. And what happens is that folks at the DOE will tell you, well, we have it at South Shore, or we have it at Sophie, or we have it at Aloma. And our kids' schools share in after-school ed partner, the Education Alliance. But those are just silos. It can't be good enough that the Noguera child can get it or my child can get it. How do we build scalability and stress the importance to all schools?
Right. I think that's similar to the question I just heard, but you're absolutely right. We can't just afford, that's right. We have models. The Children's Aid Society has created great models of full-service schools that provide these services. So we have lots of examples out there. What we don't have is consistency in access. And that's what we should be working towards. And that's where, the DOE has at least emphasized, acknowledged that this is an important area. However, that a lot of the work of making it happen is on principals. And what we're seeing in New York is where we have resourceful principals who've been able to bring in grants, have been able to create partnerships, are able to do this work, and those who are not as resourceful or located in an area where it's harder to build a partnership are not, and so the kids are not getting it. So we have to be, maybe Ms. Black, if she's the new chancellor, something we can work on with her, because it's clearly a critical area of need. One of the things that Waiting for Superman, the film, if you have seen it, doesn't ever talk about is the fact that the charter schools it holds up as models do exactly this. They also spend a lot more per kid. Right? And so when we're comparing the public schools to the charter schools, a lot of times we're comparing apples and oranges, because the dollar per student's not the same, the learning environment's not the same, and so the real question we should be asking, why aren't we doing more of that in our public schools? Why aren't we changing the structures, breaking them down, so we can provide this enriched learning environment to a greater number of kids?
Great, good morning. Thank you for sharing your experience. My question was specifically relates to, in your experience and in your research, your background, and the opportunity you've had to visit multiple schools. My question is, in your experience, how does the success of after-school programs relate specifically to working class or immigrant communities or low-income communities where oftentimes, especially in high school, students sometimes we'll only have a half day of school and we'll leave to work to support the family. So, and how after-school programs, how you can build successful after-school programs when that's the dynamic and students are forced to help and contribute to the family economically.
That's a very important issue, and it's a real challenge because, and this is especially an issue amongst immigrant children, the great pressure they feel to work, to support themselves, support their families. Now, it's not just immigrant children. Lots of kids are working. But it is an obstacle to access, and it's often the kids who need that access most who are not able to because of work. So I would say we've got to get real creative here. One of the things I've been a big advocate of for a while is career and vocational education. And I'm an advocate of it because when done right, it actually expands access not only to jobs, but to this kind of enriched learning environment. I helped to set up a biotech academy when I lived in the Bay Area. At one high school, it was actually a high school, an alternative school for the kids in trouble. Now that same partnership exists in 7 high schools. We've expanded it to 5 colleges, so kids are not just stuck at entry-level jobs, although an entry-level job in biotech pays $14 an hour, right? But it also has a career pathway that goes with it into college. And because of that kind of opportunity, kids are working in labs with biotechnicians. They're getting to see how knowledge gets applied, and they're earning money. And that's the key, is that we have some kids who do need to earn some money. And we shouldn't ignore that. And we shouldn't allow that to become a reason for not serving kids. What I think we have to do is find creative ways to build into some of what we're doing with kids the opportunity to both learn and earn, right? The Cristo Rey schools have been doing that. Now they build that into the structure and the design of their program. But that work experience can be a great learning opportunity, can be another way to open doors and serve the practical function of giving kids income. But that takes work. It takes work to figure out how to design it. But I think, if you think about if we don't do that kind of work, you start losing poor kids in high school. If kids don't see how what they're learning in school will help them to support themselves, support their families, we lose those kids. The number one reason why immigrant kids drop out of school, and immigrant kids drop out in greater numbers than any other group, is to work. Right? So we can't ignore this issue. It's a huge issue that's impacting graduation rates and college attendance and everything else. So I think it's not an easy one to solve either. So I'll acknowledge that. I'll let maybe the person with the mic.
Hi, I'm Jane Quinn from Children's Aid. I want to connect a couple of dots. You started out talking about confused thinking, and then you talked a lot about extended learning time. And I have a lot of worries about the confused thinking that I hear expressed around this notion of extended learning time. I think after school may actually disappear if we don't get political around this issue. There are proposals on Capitol Hill right now to allow the 21st Century Community Learning Centers money, which is after school and summer learning money, to be spent, to allow school districts to spend that money to extend the school day. And, I think we've heard debates in New York State about time on task with no discussion about what the task is. I mean, I think you're right that the task is about development, but I think a lot of people think the task is about getting the test scores up. So I'd love to hear your advice about this whole dilemma, the current debate that's going on about extending the school day versus expanding the learning opportunities for children.
Right. Well, I think it's a good question. I'm not against, as I said, several of the schools that are that I cited do have the extended day, like excellence. However, they also provide kids with this enriched learning. So they're building these kinds of activities I described into the day. What concerns me is that schools that don't have the resources or don't have the vision will just do more of what they've been doing for more time. And more of a bad thing is rarely a good thing, right? And so, you know, that is, you know, we have so many examples of this in particularly in education policy, where we come up with an idea, right? So they say, oh yes, our kids are not getting enough hours, they're not the year, so we're going to add more hours, we're going to create a longer day. But no one then thinks about what's the quality need to be, right? What does that need to, what needs to happen differently to make sure that that added time results in something, an enhanced learning opportunity and better outcomes. And a lot of times our policymakers don't realize that that part of the work is the essential part, right? You know, I could spend a lot of time criticizing what happens. You know, they a lot of times they think raising the standards is their job. It's up to the schools to figure out how to now respond to those higher standards. I was asked to speak before the State Board of Education in New Jersey, and just before I got there to talk about the work I'm doing in Newark, which also includes a lot of after-school programs, the State Board had just voted to require all 8th graders to take algebra. And they were shaking their hands and clapping, and I said, well, why don't you make it all 6th graders? And one of them looked at me and said, really? I said, yeah. I said, why not make it all 4th graders? I said, really? I said, well, you don't even know if you have the teachers in place to do it in 8th grade, do you? They said, well, no. And I said, so you might as well do it 4th grade too then, right? And they said, well, that's not our job to make sure the teachers are there. So we set policy. And that, to me, was the clearest indication of what's wrong, right? We're setting policy in a vacuum without a clear understanding of what it means in schools, right? And just like now they're raising the bar on the graduation requirement. I'm all for higher standards, but that's the easy part. The hard part is, okay, how do we get there? What's the work that needs to go along to get there? So I think you're right to raise these questions, and we've got to keep raising the questions. We've got to keep challenging the policymakers to think through what are the implications of these changes. What do we need to do differently if we're going to get better outcomes? And it's rarely simple. It's rarely just a matter of just adding on a few more minutes at the end of the day or a few more days at the end of the year. Especially anybody who's been in school knows June is a wasted month in most schools. Right? A wasted month because the test is over. Right? And so they don't know what to do with extra time anyway, so there's just a couple more days of field trips. So it's got to be more thoughtful. Yes?
An invitation to you to comment on something. I'm Amy Hagedorn. I'm a firm believer in after-school education, and I've been a supporter of PACE, and I think I supported this lecture. And I'm really happy to hear your lecture. What I'd like to suggest is, you talk about 8th grade to 4th grade or breaking down the silos. I'd like to suggest that people in after school and people in education, it's wonderful to see this group here in this tower of American enterprise, that we think not of the school day and after school, but think of, as you say, the whole child, and think of supports for family and infancy. And don't think about infancy and then early childhood and then school age, but think about how with a very small amount of resources, if all of us felt strongly about it, that we could support families who, with say a universal, this is what I'm advocating and I'm asking you to comment on, universal home visitations for every child born in the U.S. and family support for every child at risk or every family at risk of raising a child who doesn't succeed in school. And we know who those people are and we know how to help them. Yeah. And there are programs in existence, but they're poorly funded or they're here this year and then gone the next. So I'm asking you to comment about that kind of a movement that after school and school people could begin to think about.
Absolutely. There are several national health organizations been calling for precisely what you just articulated. That is, home visitations to assist both with prenatal as well as postnatal care, because of the huge challenges we have of particularly underage mothers giving birth, and the problems that creates not just for the child but for whole society. When you have children whose basic nutritional needs and other needs not being met early. There are many other countries that do that, so it's not a far-fetched idea. There's actually Elmira, New York, Elmira County, under the leadership of the former Chancellor Carl Hayden, started such an initiative. It goes along with their universal preschool initiative, which they pulled off through a public-private partnership. So they're doing it in one county in New York. So there are some examples of that it can be done, but it takes, and this is where the silos become a problem, because we not only have silos between schools, we have silos in policymaking. So our education policy making happens over here, and our health policy making happens over here, and our early childhood policies someplace else. And so instead of thinking more creatively across these different domains, we are working in isolation. And a lot of times the people in charge don't talk and think through how to make this happen. So I think it's a great idea, and the challenge, and that's what one of the things I've been arguing for a while. Mayoral control of schools should allow for this kind of more integrated approach to thinking about creatively how to serve children's needs, because all those departments in New York City do report to the mayor. Now the question is, can we get the mayor to see that in the vision for what schools need has to be something much more integrated and encompassing than a focus on achievement. So I think we have the potential to do something like that in New York City. A lot of people are giving the Harlem Children's Zone so much credit because it has this much more encompassing view. Then I say, well, okay, you like it, let's do more. Right? Why should those 6,000 kids in Central Harlem be the only ones when we know we have so many more children? Now, we don't have to do it in such an expensive way, right? Because obviously that'll be a big obstacle. But there are ways in which we could more efficiently use existing public resources, supplement those with some private resources to do these kinds of initiatives for a greater number of children, and we can. So, but it does require vision, it requires planning to make it possible.
Hi, I'm Keith Hefner from Youth Communication. I want to pick up on Jane's comment, since we're in this after-school setting. I, like you, I also think that I'm not absolutely committed to after school being the place where this enhanced learning happens. I think if a school can do it in an extended day and it's integrated into the school, I don't have really a problem with that. The problem for me is the practical level. I don't trust schools to do it under the current incentive structures. And I think there needs to be a counterweight and a different place. I talk to people who work in KIPP schools and work in the children's own schools and things. And the moment they don't meet their test standards, all that other stuff is gone. It's 4 extra hours of test prep. That's what the teachers are telling me. And because there is no after school, well, there is to some extent in the children's zone, but in a lot of these places there is no after school element. So it's just that stuff is just gone.
Right.
So I want to raise just a question that you could comment on. You listed a bunch of things, active learning and expanded horizons and stuff, but the one that was most important to me is mastery. I mean, that's the outcome I'm looking for in my own kids and students I work with. And yet, nowadays, there's so much data has become available that you didn't used to be able to measure teachers on the outcomes of the students because you didn't have the data of a kid over time, but now you can. So, and the corporate world has a very nice outcome, which is profit. That's the way they think.
Right.
So those standards, because of the availability of data and that way of thinking being natural in the corporate world, is now being entirely imposed on schools, and there's some good to it. But at the same time, this mastery, the opposite of mastery is the shortcut, right? And if you have a very clear outcome that you're aiming at, there is an inclination to just try and find the shortest path to it. And the shortest path is usually not mastery. So there's a huge contradiction built into the principles that are now being imposed on schools. And after school can be a counterweight to that in some respects. So I'd like your observations on that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and we see lots and lots of examples of it. There are, I think, that we have not really even scratched the surface about the amount of cheating going on in schools right now with credit recovery. Because there are a lot of schools that know they will be punished or penalized if they lose kids. So you have schools that are coming with all kinds of schemes to get kids to get the credits to graduate. Clearly no mastery. They're completing 2 years of school in a semester, and it's not because the school wants to make sure they graduate. The fact that we have so many kids in New York City who are, it's about 75% now, who are going to CUNY and have to basically repeat high school, right, is a clear sign something's wrong here in the way we've been approaching this. So I share your concern about the shortcuts. I also share your concern about just doing it through the extended day, because I think you're right, that given the pressure schools are under, that usually the thing that gets pulled out, taken out, is all these other enhancements. When you go to schools that get it right, it's because they operate with a much higher degree of confidence in their own ability to provide this enriched learning environment for kids, and to really believe that that won't come at the expense of scores, right? But not many schools have that much confidence or as much faith in what they're doing. So that's what I agree also with Jane that if we lose the funds that would go into after schools, then we're probably going to lose a lot of these resources, because they'll get taken from schools, because the educators won't know what to do with them. And I did kind of set it up before. I do think there is a dichotomy and a difference between focusing on achievement and focusing on development. And right now, what we're seeing in many of our schools is that narrow focus on achievement at the expense of development. And I don't think it should be seen that way. We've got to find ways to reconcile, to do both, and to make sure, and after school is often the place where that's happening. So I think there's a good reason to be concerned that that's going to be lost. Thank you.
Much for being here, Pedro.
Thanks, Austin. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very briefly again, thank you all for coming here to Morgan Stanley, for hosting us. Pedro, really remarkable. Janet, for your extraordinary work allowing us to be inspired on an annual basis on in important discussions. Let's continue these discussions. I think we're talking about the lives of children. I think it's something we're all responsible for in our variety of ways, and I really appreciate your coming today and your engagement. Thank you very much.